Hello, Rachel and Stacy. Welcome.
Hi.
Hello. As usual, I'll wait a few minutes. Let me know if you have any questions or anything in the meantime. Well, where's everybody?
I don't know. It is. Oh, one more person.
Oh, yeah. I'll wait one more minute, but then I'm just going to get started. People miss out. They miss out. Oh, there's Maggie. Cassandra. Okay, I'll turn this fan off. It's kind of loud. Oh, it feels warm in here.
Oh, don't forget to start pressing record.
Thank you, thank you. Oh yeah, and actually, I wanted to talk about that because a lot of people had problems with the big blue button, the recording software that just comes preloaded with Canvas. There's just no control that I have over it, and so some people can't watch it. Then it deletes itself after 2 weeks. I can't edit it. I can't name it anything. So I'm not going to use it anymore, or at least I'm going to try something different and see how it works. So I'm using a third-party software, Bandicam, that captures my screen, and hopefully that'll work better for people. I can turn it into a regular video. I can even put it on YouTube, just to make it more accessible. Does that sound okay to everyone? I'll just, yeah, and you won't even need to look for it in conferences anymore. I'll just sort of upload it onto the week's module. So when you go to week 5 module, you'll be able to find the missed class right away if you didn't make it. So I'm trying that today. So it's a trial run. We'll see how it works. I used it last semester when it wasn't in a live setting, right? Last semester when Corona hit and we finished off the semester, I didn't have these live meetings. I just recorded everything and I used this and it worked. So hopefully it'll just work. Okay, yeah. Well, but this hopefully will make it even easier to access the videos. I also upgraded my Prezi account so that I can, with my phone, change the pages. So isn't that nice? So now I don't have to go over to the other page and switch it and stuff. So I can stay on this page and everything's right here in front of me. Okay. Okay. Did anyone have any questions while we're waiting? Okay, well then just a little review, right? Hopefully me reviewing this. Oh, by the way, can you see a little clicky? I can't see it on here, but supposedly the program does it. Or maybe it won't do it until it's recorded. Yeah, probably not. Never mind. Well, hopefully this review here is really boring review. Hopefully everyone knows these concepts and these words now. It's very important that you understand that the idea of an argument is central through the whole class. Right? It's a central concept And we're surrounded by arguments all the time. People think they're right, and then they give us their reasons why they think they're right. That's an argument, right? But there's a whole science of argumentation. Some arguments do not work for very specific reasons. And that's what this class is about, right? Evaluating arguments, right? And so that's just the word that we use. So an argument in this class, it doesn't mean a verbal dispute, fighting with someone. It doesn't mean that. It's just what we call a conclusion supported by at least one supporting reason, at least one premise, right? That's the idea of a premise. It's your supporting reason. It's your basis for saying the thing that you're saying. Okay, and they have to be statements, of course, true or false sentences, since that's what we're part of what we're evaluating. Okay, so hopefully you get that, right? An argument is a conclusion supported by one or more premises. I like to just repeat that so it gets stuck in your head. So you'll wake up in the middle of the night just thinking, just a voice echoing in your head. An argument is a conclusion supported by one or more premises. Okay. So we did that. Let's see. Yeah, we did that exercise. Okay. We did all this. I'm just going to go through it really quick. Okay, so we left off here. Oops. Right, here's just one quick page of how do you basically reconstruct an argument. And then from here on out, we're going to go look at each one of those point by point, right? So we'll look at 1, 2, 3, and 4. Last time we finished up until 3, I believe. Okay, so we'll go through those. So remember what we're doing here. We're trying to figure out how to extract an argument out of a bunch of sentences that someone says, right? Because people do provide arguments, but they provide more than arguments a lot of times. They have a lot of extra information, little words that don't really make a difference for evaluating, where we want to really simplify everything and get everything really clean so that it's easy to evaluate. Okay. I keep forgetting. I gotta do it with my phone. Okay, so we looked at conclusion indicators and premise indicators. Right, these are little heuristics, right? Heuristic devices it's just a shortcut to quickly narrow down where you think the premises might be and the conclusion might be. And remember, it's not a foolproof technique. It's just, in many cases, it allows you to quickly identify a premise or a conclusion. But you still have to look at the overall writing, right? You have to have an overall understanding of what's being conveyed. Otherwise, you're just guessing, right? We don't want that. But looking at those indicators is a quick little cheat to narrow it down, perhaps. All right, we did all this, so we trimmed the fats. Okay. Okay, and this is where we left off, right? I had you do those exercises. 2 through 6. We did the first one. And so the whole point was, can you do that? Can you figure out what the argument is by taking out everything that doesn't contribute to the main idea of the argument? Oh, by the way, really quick. So Stacy's asking a good question. Are you talking about the ones where I want you to present it in premise conclusion format? Yeah. So first of all, that is what I was bringing up anyway. I when I started this class and I structured it all, I called a certain part of it reflections, weekly reflection section. That's still there, and it's still 20% of your grade, but I'm including exercises in that. It's really going to be more exercises. I wasn't really thinking, when I teach this class on campus, we do a lot of in-class exercises. And for some reason, I transferred all my online components and kept them online, but I really should transfer the exercise part of it as well. So it's not exactly reflections every week anymore. It's going to be more some exercises for you to do to exercise this stuff. So then, as to your question, well, what does it say how to do a premise conclusion format? Right. Now, if you were here for the last meeting, we did actually discuss this. When you put something in premise conclusion format, you go premise 1, say what it is, premise 2, say what it is, however many premises there are, then a line, and then it says conclusion, and then you have what it says. So you don't need to leave in any of the premise indicators or the conclusion indicators. In fact, you should not. I don't want to see those in the reconstructed argument at all, because we're already saying here's a premise and here's a premise and here's a conclusion, right? So it would be redundant to also say therefore or thus or because or anything like that. Those will all get trimmed out, right? Those help you locate the premises and the conclusions. But when you reconstruct the argument in premise conclusion formats, you do not want to include those. That would just be redundant and it would get confusing. Okay, does that help? Hopefully that answers your question. Yeah. Okay, so for this exercise, so that's something that you would do as well. And notice, Stacy, look at the first one. This means that is a conclusion indicator, right? And I crossed it out. We're cutting out the fact. This tells us that what's coming next is the conclusion, right? Something or someone must have created the universe out of nothing. That's the conclusion. So that's what you would put in premise conclusion format. The very bottom, you've got a line, and underneath of it, you'll say conclusion in brackets. And then it'll say someone or something must have created the universe. You don't say this means that. It's a conclusion indicator. When you have it in premise conclusion format, it's already totally clear where the conclusion is. Okay. So what about number 2? Cut out the fat. So people who did this, now I'm not sure how I can ask you. This is kind of difficult too. If you're going to type it out. Let me see. Oh, Maggie's saying something, so I'm going to wait just a sec maybe. No. Well, I will just tell you then. I assume that you've already done it. Since, yeah, we leave out since. We'd also leave out obviously. It's not necessary. You don't need your commentary on how obvious it is to anyone. Right? And people argue about free will, but it's really pretty simple. Right? This is just introducing the subject, introducing the topic. Right? We don't talk like robots, but when you have an argument in premise conclusion format, it looks almost robotic. But that's because that's a good way to make it very, very clear and a good way to be able to set yourself up to evaluate the argument. Right, so when we're doing that, we're going to take out all that stuff that you don't need. Right, so since obviously can also be, we don't need that, and see, simple. We don't need that either. That's just more commentary on the argument. Right, so the whole argument would be, if I put it in premise conclusion format, it would go premise 1. If we don't have free will, we're not morally responsible for anything we do. Premise 2. We are morally responsible for at least some of the things we do. Line. Conclusion. Free will must be real. Yeah? Or we have free will if you want to keep the language consistent. And that's something to do as well, as long as it doesn't change the meaning. Okay? So that would be some of the fat that you would trim out. Stacy, I'll keep an eye on what you're typing. Number 3, I just gave the answer, but yeah. And so Stacy's saying number 3, get rid of the first sentence. Let me tell you about the difference between cats and dogs, intelligence, right? That's again introducing the subject. That's totally fine, but for our argument, we don't need that. You're right. And then you see is not necessary. That's right. And clearly. And even this means that, right? This means that is a premise or a conclusion indicator. We don't need that either. Right. So it's pretty simple. Premise 1, dogs are much easier to train than cats. Premise 2, dogs are more intelligent. Remember that other trick as well, right? We wouldn't want to say they because it's a pronoun, and if we know who we're talking about or what we're talking about, we should always specify, since they is vague. In everyday language, it's not, because we're pretty good at realizing that they refers to the previous thing referred to, right? But when you're laying it out in premise conclusion format, you want to get rid of all ambiguity. You want to make it crystal clear. So, right now we just trimmed out the fats, but if you were to put this into a premise conclusion format, you would actually say, where was I? Trying to find where I was. You would actually say dogs are more intelligent rather than they are more intelligent. Okay? So Stacy, you're right. It's just you also get rid of that premise indicator. Yeah. This next one, I'll just do it. We got a lot to go through, so hopefully you did this exercise already, right? Yeah, here's a bunch of other stuff as well, right? The person's introducing this argument, and then there's, this is sort of a third person description of somebody else's argument and what they're saying, and you can sort of get rid of the extraneous stuff. Therefore, we take it out because it's a conclusion indicator, and we just don't need that. Now, that said, sometimes people will do that in a premise conclusion format. Okay, it's not a huge sin. It's not going to mess everything up. It's just cleaner and easier to take those out because we're already laying it out when we put it into premise conclusion formats. Right, so yeah, if you just left it like this, then it would get confusing because maybe you don't know where the premises or the conclusions are, right? But here we're cutting out the fat in order to put it into that format, right? And in that format, it's clearly labeled conclusion, right? There isn't maybe that's a conclusion indicator, maybe not, right? It's conclusion, and then it says what it says, right? So it's hard to stop saying therefore, right? You can still use it in ordinary language, and when you're saying an argument in premise conclusion formats, you'll still use the word, right? You're not going to say line, right? You'll still say therefore, thus, or so. But when you're writing it out, and you have got that conclusion right there at the bottom, and it's labeled conclusion, don't also write therefore, right? It's just no point to it. It just clutters it up. Keep it clean and simple. We already have that format for a specific reason. Okay? Good questions. And ask all these questions. Very good that you asked them. And there might be things that I've mentioned once, I don't think I have to talk about it again, but sometimes, I'll say something quickly or not fully explain something. So it's always a good idea to ask a question, even if you feel like I already said, or even if you don't want to look like you weren't paying attention, right? I'm never going to think that or judge you for that. So ask any question you have at all. So the argument boils down to if this bucket has a leak in it, a hole in it, then it will leak. The bucket doesn't leak, therefore the bucket doesn't have a hole in it, right? Now I put bucket in, pretending like I'm actually reconstructing the whole argument, right? Once again, because it says it's. And when you reconstruct an argument, you don't want to say it's, you want to say what it is. Yeah. But here, that's all you would do to cut out the fat, to get ready to put it into that format. Okay. So lots of stuff to get rid of, and you do want to make sure, insofar as it's possible, that you end up with full sentences still, right? Actual true or false statements. Sometimes that won't be possible just because the way that grammar works and the way that people speak. Sometimes you'll have to rephrase something once you put it into the argument format. So here you can cut out what the person's here to do, right? And then there's several reasons. Now that's a premise indicator, isn't it? Right? Here's several reasons for it. Yeah, it's great. So that helps you find the premises. But you don't need to write that into the argument conclusion format, the premise conclusion format, so just cross it out, right? So what you end up with is you should consider getting solar panels. Why? Well, solar panels are environmentally friendly. You can get the tax credit for getting solar panels, and you'll end up saving money in the long run if you get solar panels. Right? That's it. One conclusion at the bottom, 3 different reasons for believing that the conclusion is true. Yes, 5 does, right? Let's see. 1, 2, 3. Yep, indeed. Yeah. And notice a lot of times we end up with 2 premises, sometimes 1, but remember the definition. 1 or more premises, right? So one conclusion, always one conclusion, or at least one main conclusion, right? The main point you're making. Sometimes you have to argue for the premises themselves, right? We'll get into that in a second. That's a sub-argument. That happens all the time. Hopefully, if you've ever had a discussion with someone where you're both disagreeing, you end up disagreeing about a lot, not just the main points, but also the things that the person is bringing up in support of their point, right? They'll say whatever the point is that they're making, and they say, yeah, didn't you hear about this thing that happened? And then you say, wait, that didn't really happen though, or that was twisted in the news, or, so very often we question people's premises, and then those premises themselves need to be argued for in a sub-argument. So that does happen. So in that sense, you can have more than one conclusion, but there's always going to be one main conclusion, right, that you're disagreeing about. Okay, so one conclusion supported by many premises, right? At least one, possibly more. So 5 is a good example of that. 3 premises, no sub-arguments, right? We've kept things pretty simple so far. Okay, here's a bunch of random stuff you can get rid of as well, right? You can get rid of listen, guys. I think we can all agree. Get rid of and. It's a sure thing. Once again, it's commentary on how sure it is. You can be sure. At the end, am I right or am I right? Right? It's a rhetorical question. It's not one of these ones that you need to translate because it ends up not being part of the main argument. Right? The main conclusion here is that if Parker goes to Las Vegas, he'll spend half the night at the craps table. Right? Why? Well, if he goes to Las Vegas, Las Vegas. If Parker goes to Las Vegas, he'll wind up in a casino, right? And what happens when he goes to the casino? He always ends up at the craps table. Right? So that's a pretty straightforward argument. Yeah, you do need all the other stuff because that's one simple statement, right? It's if then, and it does not include that information about the casino. Right? You need that casino to link those 2 arguments to get that conclusion. Yeah. Because it's one of those things where, if someone says, if Parker goes to Las Vegas, he'll spend half the night at the craps table. And someone says, well, how do you know that? It's like, well, because every time he goes there, he definitely is going to go to the casino. And whenever he goes there, eventually he ends up right there. Well, it's just a kind of it's a neat kind of argument format that has actually always a good form for the argument. It's always a valid argument. If you go if A then B, if B then C, therefore if A then C. Okay. It's called a hypothetical syllogism. And we'll learn about that later. But yeah, so you do need it all in there because once again, that's just. It's one claim being made, that if-then statement. Now, it is one of those complex ones where there's 2 statements nestled in the statement, but that's not enough. But I could see what you're saying, as you're sort of saying, well, if this happens, then this happens, right? Yeah. But we need a support for that if-then statement. And that's what those 2 premises provide. No, you don't always do the conclusion first. No. Well, what do you mean by doing the conclusion first? Sorry. There's several things. There's several ways to interpret that. For one, when you're writing something, and you're talking, and you're presenting an argument, No, sometimes people put the conclusion first, sometimes they put it later, sometimes they put it in the middle, sometimes it's just implied and they don't say it at all, right? So in everyday context, people put the conclusion wherever, okay? When you put it into premise conclusion formats, you put the conclusion at the bottom, right? If you want to write that first, that's up to you, right? But you put it at the bottom and the premise is on top. The third thing is when you're looking at an argument, what are you going to look for first? And there I have suggested look for the conclusion first. Right? Try to find what the person's main point is. And then you can see more easily what is being offered in direct support of that statement and what stuff is extraneous. Right? So there's 3 different ways there of answering your question, Maggie. I'm not sure which one you had in mind. Yeah. When you're analyzing a piece of writing or what someone has said, try to first identify the conclusion. Yes, that's true. Yeah. When you're writing it in premise conclusion format, you put the conclusion at the bottom. I don't care when you write it. If you like writing out of order, like you want to start at the bottom, like you're creating a building, that's up to you, right? Yeah. Yeah, that's fine, Maggie. You can write it first and then, yep, that's not a problem. As long as when you have the end result, it's going to look that specific format, right? Okay, so we're on 4 of reconstructing arguments. So we went through the rephrasing rhetorical questions already. So I'm just putting this here as a reminder. But here I just want to talk about pronouns when it's avoidable. Right. Sometimes you don't know who you're talking about, but in this case, it's pretty clear who you're talking about. You're talking about Susan. So this is where you get into that thing where it starts to sound a bit robotic for everyday purposes, but for the purposes of making everything very clear and unambiguous and transparent and easier to evaluate, this is what you'd want to do, right? So you'd actually want to say, Susan is attentive to my needs. Susan is a great listener. Susan is really great, is really fun to be with. Susan makes a great best friend. Therefore, she makes a great best friend, right? So yeah, it's just an example of we've said Susan in everyday language. Then you're not going to be confused about this, and you know who or she refers to. But when you put it into this format, you will want to specify who it is that you're talking about. Okay. Here's another example, right? Now, also remember, right, all the examples that I put up here, they are never supposed to be convincing to you or anything. There's no sort of slant to these. They are just different examples of different arguments that people have taken, right? So here someone is taking a stance on abortion. That's not me or this class taking any kind of stance. It's just an example of an argument that people do offer. I hope that's clear to everyone. And I try to include examples from different political sides and different religious sides and different moral sides and things like that, right? So it's going to be very inconsistent in that way because that's not the point of it, right? The point is just to give you an example of an argument, whether it's something you agree with or not, right? Whether it's something I agree with or not, it doesn't matter. I'm not even telling you what I feel about this argument or what I think about it. I'm just presenting it as an argument. And I'm only saying that because this is a hot button issue, right? This is a controversial issue. If you take an ethics class, you'll actually talk quite a bit about things like that, right? So here the argument is abortion is immoral because it is the killing of an innocent human, which is immoral. Right? So a nice example of a short sentence that's actually a whole argument with 2 premises. But here the main thing is we don't, when we reconstruct it, we don't want to say it, right? So abortion is immoral because, okay, so we know that abortion is immoral is going to be the conclusion, right? Why? Well, because is a premise indicator, right? So here's the main claim being made, abortion is immoral, and then because, and here are the 2 reasons. it involves the killing of an innocent human being, and killing an innocent human being is immoral. Right? So two premises in support of one conclusion, but it's all in one neat little argument. And this is what it would look like. Right, so abortion is the killing of an innocent human. Then for premise number 2, you don't want to say it is immoral. Right? Yes. Sorry, I got confused because I was reading the conclusion first. Hey, it happens to me too. So the conclusion is abortion is immoral, right? Then in the actual pre-formatted argument, it says it is the killing of an innocent human being. And on premise number 2, premise number 1, we specify what it refers to. So premise number 1 does not simply say it is the killing of an innocent human, right? Rather say exactly what it is, right? So now we have a nice little argument with a good logical form to it, right? You might question the premises, whether they're true or not, right? But you can see here that this is an argument where two premises together are supposed to support the conclusion. The main point here being, when you put it into this format, make everything crystal clear. Don't use words like it if you know what it refers to. So here, let's do the same thing we did last time. Let's just take 10 minutes. Okay. And I will pause. See, here's another nice thing as well, is I can easily pause the recording so that when you look at this later, there's not going to be all this dead space. Okay, so I'm going to give you 10 minutes to do this. Okay, so try to do the best you can. Put it in premise conclusion formats, the way that you learned. Premise 1, premise 2, line, conclusion. Don't put in any of the conclusion indicators or premise indicators, right? And then get rid of pronouns so that it's all spelled out exactly each time. Okay, so 10 minutes to do that. I'll keep an eye on the chat box so that if you have questions, I'll look at that. I'm gonna turn my camera off for a sec. Oops. Did that change the window? I just realized when I turned it off, everything got bigger. So did that mess up the text? It didn't mess it up? Huh. Okay, let me try it again. Let's see. Okay, let me know, because this looks weird to me. It looks like it's cutting out. Oh, no, it's not cutting it out for you. It's cutting it out for the people. The people at home. Okay, cool. Okay. That was about 10 minutes. Boy, that looks very small. Can you even read that? You know what I'm going to start doing, and maybe it'll put it down on the actual computer screen. It'll be easier. I had it all written out, but it looks so tiny. Can anyone read it? Up here, yeah? I guess maybe if you make it big. Well, anyway, I don't know. Yeah, the board is what I meant. It looks good here, but I gotta figure out some way to do this part of the class. This is not gonna work very well, is it? Well, it's easy enough. What do you say for number 1? Did anyone just want to? Yeah, thank you, Maggie. Thank you. I know there is kind of like and then I have to not share the other screen. That's okay, actually. Yeah, next time I will just put it into here, right? So I can actually do stuff right here. It's a little tricky to do that. I'll try to do that. When I have these exercises, I'm so used to doing them in class where, we'll write them out and go over them together. So I guess I'll try to think ahead more next time, and I'll try to put up the answers on this whiteboard instead. I think that might work. Okay, now let me go back to where did it go? The conclusion, yeah, everyone should run for exercise, right? It says specifically for exercise. You have to be a stickler for those details, because maybe the person is not saying everyone should run, right? Maybe they're just saying if you're going to exercise, it's running that you should do, right? So you got to there it is. No, there it is. Okay. Alt tab. This is still a little tricky to go back and forth. Yeah, Connie, you got it. Stacy, run for exercise. If you put it into premise conclusion format, remember you got to get rid of the it's. Right? It's is a pronoun. We know we're talking about exercise, so that's why you should say running every time. Sorry, not exercise, but run. Right? So running is fun. Running is healthy. Therefore, you should run for exercise. Okay, good. Okay, now hold on. Let me get that screen back. Okay, there. That's better. I don't know why it didn't work last time. Okay, what about number 2? Premise 1. Just tell me the only premise that there is. What is premise 1? What should it say? If you're putting this in premise conclusion format, and you have P1 or premise 1, Peter is an honest person. Yeah, exactly. Yes, yep, that's it. Yeah. I noticed, by the way, he'll put it up really close. I just want to show, when you write premise 1, premise 2, conclusion, it's okay if you don't write the whole word premise or the whole word conclusion out. Right, so we'll do a shorthand P1 for premise 1. P2, and then a C for conclusion. Okay, so that's fine if you do it that way. So yeah, if you have premise 1, right? Peter is an honest person. You can trust Peter. Okay. Number 3. I'll just tell you, all right. The conclusion is, if you want to be healthy, you should avoid most sodas. Right, that's the conclusion. Premise 1 would be, most sodas have a high amount of corn syrup. Okay. Premise 2, you want to talk about them being unhealthy. But of course it says which is very unhealthy. You can't have that as a premise because it's not a statement. Which is very unhealthy is a sentence fragment. So you have to say, well, what's the which talking about, right? Well, it's talking about high amounts of corn syrup, right? So if you were to lay this out, it would say, as this does over here, probably can't read it, but show you. Most sodas have high amounts of corn syrup. High amounts of corn syrup is unhealthy. Therefore, right, that means therefore, conclusion, if you want to be healthy, then you should avoid most sodas. Okay? Exercise number 4. If lots of people are moving away from urban environments to the suburbs, there must be an economic explanation. This is actually happening right now, so there must be an economic explanation. What's the conclusion? It's a little bit tricky because you might want to fill it out a little bit. You might be tempted, but the way in which they stated it, the way in which in premise number 4, if you were just to look for a conclusion indicator, right? Yeah, right, there's the word so. So it says there must be an economic explanation. Yeah, exactly. Now this is a little bit tricky because it's a little bit like, well, is this one of those cases that's a little bit like using a pronoun where we're saying an economic explanation, but it's an economic explanation for a specific thing, right? I don't, I didn't put that in there to make you worry about that, right? For this, you can just say that the conclusion is there must be an economic explanation, or you could simply say there must be an economic explanation for why people are moving away from urban environments to the suburbs. Right? That's the explanation that they're talking about. So you could spell it all out like that. For this exercise, I didn't need you to do that. For this exercise, the main point was that you replace this is actually happening right now, right? This is actually happening right now. Well, what's this referring to? What's actually happening, right? You cannot put that as a premise. You have to get rid of this. So premise number 1, you could say simply what the first sentence says. Premise number 1. If lots of people are moving away from urban environments to the suburbs, there must be an economic explanation for that, right? For the fact that they're moving. This is actually happening right now. Well, let's rephrase that and simply say, lots of people are moving away from urban environments to the suburbs. Simple, right? So then it's very clean. If lots of people are moving away from urban environments, there must be an economic explanation for that. I'm shortening it a little bit, right? People are moving away from urban environments to the suburbs. Line, conclusion. There must be an economic explanation for the fact that people are moving away from urban environments. Okay? Okay. So I didn't mean for that one to be extra confusing because of the conclusion sort of vaguely says economic explanation without specifying what it is. If you were to really reconstruct the argument, you probably would want to finish that off, because what they're saying is they're talking about an economic explanation for this phenomena that they're talking about, right? So you might after all want to reconstruct that. For this exercise though, I just wanted you to get rid of this is actually happening right now, right? Instead of that, just say the thing that was already stated in the first premise, right? What is this? It's this phenomena of people moving away from urban environments. Okay. And what about number 5? Let's just say all we really need here is what would you put as the conclusion? That's all I really need here as well, just like the last one, because that's where the problem lies. Because again, remember, the exercise is getting rid of well, there's better fires protection out there. Is that a premise or a conclusion, Stacy? Well, if I were to say you can get rid of your virus protections, Stacy, you know why? No, sorry, the other way around, right? What if I said, Stacy, there's better virus protection out there? Why? Because you can get rid of your virus protection. That wouldn't really make sense of it. Wouldn't really make sense, would it? Right. And also there's a conclusion indicator, so that helps. Right. What's the conclusion indicator? Right. So get rid of it is what we're working with. Right. Yeah. That's the conclusion as stated. Right, exactly, Stacey. You got it. So is the conclusion indicator. So right after that, you can get rid of it is the conclusion. How would you write that, right? Given this exercise, what are we doing to make it crystal clear? Maggie, you got it. Yes, right? The conclusion, if you're going to restate it into premise conclusion format, your conclusion would say, conclusion, you can just get rid of McAfee virus protection. This is an argument I stand behind, by the way. McAfee, first of all, the guy, John McAfee, behind it is a complete nutcase. But the software that gets loaded with a lot of PCs, it's just, who gets viruses anymore anyway? Turn that stuff off. Yeah, you still do. Use something else. Other free stuff. Super anti-spyware. Lots of free stuff that works really well. McAfee is just sort of like running the whole time and just drains everything. Maybe it's changed. I don't know. You can tell I've got a thing about this. Okay, but that's all. No. So here, hopefully this is pretty clear. Maybe you still have questions in general about how to reconstruct arguments and how to find the premises and the conclusions, right? All that stuff is still going to be a little tricky. For this exercise, all I really wanted you to become aware of is pronouns that refer to something. When you put it into a premise or a conclusion, you want to get rid of the pronouns and make everything crystal clear, right? You can get rid of it. Well, you're reading the argument. We know we're talking about McAfee virus protection, but when you're writing it in an argument format, you want to make it all completely clear. You don't want any guesswork. Right? That's the point here. Okay. Then when you're reconstructing, you'll want to check for missing or implied premises and put them in the argument as well. This can also be tricky. This is mostly going to happen in what are called deductive arguments. In inductive arguments, it's a little bit unnecessary, right? This is always hard because I have to explain something basic, but then to explain it, I want to jump ahead to something you haven't learned yet. Okay, so this might be a little bit tricky, but at least in some cases, it's going to be pretty obvious, right, what you might do. So what if I just said this? You should bring an umbrella since it's raining. Okay. It's raining. The "it's there" does not function like something that's referring to something else, right? So that's not something you have to worry about. It's raining just means it's raining. We don't have to say the sky is raining or anything like that. So the "it's there" you don't have to worry about. Simply, well, it's raining, therefore you should bring an umbrella. That's pretty crystal clear for us already, isn't it? It's just sort of, we don't state every single unstated thing. We rely on one another to fill in these little missing gaps. So very quickly, anyone listening to this can just fill in, well, what's the missing premise that the person wasn't stating? Does anyone want to? What would you say is the missing premise here? Something very simple. You don't have to overthink it. But we just have two separate statements here, right? One statement is it's raining. The other statement is you should bring an umbrella. Well, what do these two have to do with each other? Well, we need some sort of simple statement that links them up. See if anyone can guess what it is. I mean, your brain knows it. Yes, exactly, Rachel. Thank you. Yeah. You need an umbrella, or if it's raining, you should bring an umbrella, right? That sort of thing. So even if you weren't able to spell it out, your brain at a subconscious level already knows, oh yeah, that's just what the person means. It's because an umbrella is something you typically bring when it's raining, and if you have an umbrella, right? So it's easy. It's always easiest to turn it into an if-then statement. You know? In many cases, in many cases, if you have an argument with one premise and then a conclusion, but the premise and the conclusion talk about different things, like in this case, right? The premise was about raining. The conclusion was about bringing an umbrella. We know they're related, but they're not the same concepts. Right? So in many cases where you have that, where you have a premise and then a conclusion where they're talking about different things, in many cases all you need is an if-then statement to link them up. Right? So if your statement is A and your conclusion is B, right, well, then you're probably missing a premise that says if A, then B. Right? Then it works. 2 on the last set of exercises have an implied premise that you can trust honest people. Yeah, exactly. So you'd want to fill in that premise in that case. We looked at other arguments. This is what I was talking about, the difference between deductive and inductive arguments. For example, the Jones, who's the murderer suspect, the murder suspect case, right, where you're laying out all the evidence. Right? They had a motive. They were seen at the scene of the crime. They had the murder weapon. They confessed. And you lay out all these individual pieces of evidence. There, you don't need to specify it. Right? There, you're building a cumulative case. It's an inductive argument. You don't have to say, well, for each of them, if they had a motive, then they're the murderer. Well, that's not even true, right? You have to have lots of different pieces of evidence altogether. So when you have an inductive argument, it's just built into the argument. It's just basically saying, if all these premises are true, then that supports the conclusion. Okay. Hopefully we'll just be able to avoid problems until we get there. Right? For now, just simply notice, is there something missing from the premise to the conclusion? Even if it's something very simple and straightforward, like in this one, right? Still, it's raining. You should bring an umbrella. They just seem like two statements. We know they're connected because we know about umbrellas and rain, but it's not explicitly stated, so we can see that it logically must follow. Because now look at the argument. Now you can see that it's just, well, if that first premise is true, and the second premise is true, then the conclusion must follow. Before the Reconstruction, we don't have that, right? We just have it's raining, and you should bring an umbrella. Well, that leaves it open, a logical possibility that maybe it's raining and you don't need to bring an umbrella. There's no logical contradiction there. Right? If you're to say, yeah, I agree with your premise, but I disagree with your conclusion, there's no logical inconsistency. Okay? For the reconstructed argument in premise conclusion format, well, here you'd be contradicting yourself if you were to say, yeah, I agree with the premises, but not the conclusion. Right? That doesn't make any sense. Right? So that's why missing premises usually happen in deductive arguments like that, where there's a logical inconsistency if you accept the premise, but you reject the conclusion. It just doesn't make any sense. I hope everyone sees that. I hope you're reasonable and rational enough to understand that if you do agree with both of the premises, then you must agree with the conclusion, or you're just not understanding something, right? There's just a logical inconsistency. You could easily simply disagree with a premise, right? You could disagree with premise number 1. We were talking about running a second ago. I like to run just about every day. Maybe, I don't know if anyone has seen me out there. I run the streets of Eureka every day. And if it's raining, I'll usually still go unless it's terrible. And I'm not bringing no umbrella, right? So I would just reject premise number 1 in that case. I just don't think premise 1 is true, so I don't think I should bring an umbrella just because it's raining, right? But here I'm disagreeing with the premises, not the logic of the argument. The logic is right? And the logic being right just means if these premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. Or, to put it in more personal psychological terms, if you agree with both of the premises, then you must agree with the conclusion, or else you'd be logically inconsistent. Okay, here's another one. We looked at this free will argument. By the way, this class also gets you ready for Intro to Philosophy, if you ever take that, because I do like to bring up some of these arguments that we do in Intro to Philosophy. Right? You're learning how to evaluate philosophical arguments just by looking at these exercises. Of course, free will doesn't exist. After all, every event, including your choices, is completely determined by previous events. Now, we've already put this into premise conclusion format. As stated, this is all it says. It simply says that free will doesn't exist. Right? We can get rid of course. We don't need that, right? Remember that, cutting out the fat. You don't need the exclamation mark. That doesn't provide any extra meaning. Right? It doesn't change the truth value of the statement when you say it real loud. You know, people don't always know that, especially on the internet. Right? All caps means you're right, doesn't it? Yeah. But yeah, so the point here is, right, it just doesn't matter to say of course or the exclamation mark. So it just says free will doesn't exist. What's the evidence provided? Well, you don't need the after all part either. That's just sort of rhetorical, grammatical sort of an artifact. That doesn't change the truth value of what we're talking about. So you can get rid of that, and you simply have every event, including your choices, is completely determined by previous events. It's the same sort of thing as the umbrella and the rain example, right? We know that these things have to do with one another a bit, or at least they make us, we think that they do, right? This idea of, well, choices being determined, that sounds like it's not friendly to free will in some way. But for this to be a really logically compelling argument, you need to show the link between the two. You actually need to explicitly state what the link is between the two. And again, in many cases, including this one, all you really need is an if-then statement to tie the two together, right? To tie the premise to the conclusion in a second premise. So what would the second premise be? Can anyone take a guess? I just gave you the answer, basically. Right. What's the missing premise in this argument? It's much simpler than you think. Right. Remember what I said. In many cases, if you have an argument where you have a statement, let's say A, and then a conclusion, B, and that's all you have is A and B, and there's no logical connection between the two, then simply state that if A is true, then B is true. So that's all you need here. You just need a premise that says, if this premise is true, then this conclusion is true. Okay, so if that's not clear, like this. You see that? So again, it's not always going to be like this, but in many cases you can simply turn it into an if-then statement, where the first part of the if-then statement is your premise and the second is your conclusion. Because then it logically follows, doesn't it? If it's true that, okay, everyone pay attention, right? Think about this for a second. If every event is completely determined by previous choices, by previous events, then free will doesn't exist. Let's suppose that that's true. Right? And then let's suppose that it's true that every event is completely determined by previous events. Well, then it follows logically that free will doesn't exist. Does everyone see that? When we provided the missing premise here, we turn it into a logically valid argument. The logic checks out. If both of those premises are true, the conclusion is true. Of course, you might completely disagree with either of those premises, right? When you start looking at the free will debates, people do argue either of those premises or against them. Here, all we're seeing is to show the logic of the argument, you need to present that missing premise. At first, it simply went A, therefore B. Well, what we wanted to say is A. If A, then B. Therefore, B. If then makes it easier. You're simply linking the premise to the conclusion in some way, so that it's logically linked in that way. Right? I know it's a lot of words right on the page, and it's a lot of deep stuff to think about. But I'm saying you don't even actually have to worry about whether free will exists, whether all choices are determined. You don't even have to think about that. Just look at the format of it. Right? It simply says events are determined by previous events. And then premise 2 says, if events are determined by previous events, then free will doesn't exist. Therefore, it logically follows that free will doesn't exist. Right? Only if you actually agree to the premises, of course, right? But here, what we're trying to do is show the logic of the initial argument. There was a premise missing that we need to put in there. Okay? And that's very, very important in the free will debate, because that premise actually often gets taken for granted. The old way of thinking about determinism and free will was that it's got to be one or the other. That you either have free will or everything is determined, but they can't both be true. That's because people were assuming that premise number 2 is true. It actually turns out lots of people argue against that. Lots of people say that even if determinism is true, if every single event ever was completely determined by previous events, our concept of free will is actually totally compatible with that. Right? Now, whether that's right or not is a whole other thing, but the point here is that we've made progress on the problem of free will by making that premise explicit, by actually spelling it out, by actually making this if-then statement. Because then we can say, well, is that actually true? Is it really true that free will requires things not being determined? Right? It may not be true. Okay. So I hope people didn't get sidetracked by the interesting philosophical issue. You don't have to worry about that. We're not in philosophy 10, right? So you don't have to worry about that too much. All I wanted to show is the argument itself was missing a premise, right? Premise 1 was not enough to show that premise 2, that the conclusion must be true. You need another premise to make it logically compelling. Oops. Okay, let's do one more exercise. Take about 10 minutes and see if you can figure out the missing premises. Remember, when in doubt, see if you can simply link the two, the premise to the conclusion by having a premise that's an if-then statement. Right? So if the premise is A and the conclusion is B, then your missing premise will be if A then B. Okay? You could do different ways as well. You don't have to use the if then. You can use your own ability, your own words if you want. If then is the easiest way to do it. Okay. I'll give you 10 minutes to do that, then we'll go over it, and then we'll be done, okay? I'm going to pause the recording again. Oops. Sorry, everyone. Just for the people watching this video, I didn't unpause it after we did the exercise, just the last one. I'm so sorry about that. There was only about 7 minutes of content that you missed, so it's okay, but sorry about that. It's just going over the exercise. Okay, now I'm going to stop it again for real. End the video.